Do you ever wonder if you are cursed with picking the slow line? I'm talking about the line at the grocery store, like Costco especially is this way for me. I swear, I always am in the slow line. I'm in the one where the checkout computer breaks down, or they have to replace the receipt paper, or the person in front of me has a price check. It is a special kind of agony to be waiting in line. We Americans are generally not big fans of any kind of waiting. And waiting is the theme of chapter 4 in our book, When Church Stops Working, A Future for Your Congregation Beyond More Money, Programs, and Innovation by Andrew Root and Blair Bertrand. The title of chapter 4 is Time to Wait. But for what? The authors begin on page 61 reminding us about the grocery store. They use the highway and waiting, and it's painful. And they describe some stages of waiting. But then they make a change to introduce the book of Acts. Acts in the Bible actually begins as a story of waiting. Jesus instructs his disciples to wait for the gift from God, which is a baptism by the Holy Spirit, which will empower them. Well, this is a really well-known story, and typically what we do then is we just jump immediately to when the Holy Spirit comes and empowers the disciples. Rarely ever do we think about the waiting. Rarely ever do we think about that in-between period. And the authors remind us that Jesus has given them the command to wait. Wait for God to act, not for the apostles to act. The apostles are to wait. God is the actor. The apostles will act, sure, but only out of their waiting. Only after waiting and receiving a gift will they act. Their action is only in response to God's action. So with all that talk of waiting, it might cause us to wonder, did they actually end up waiting? We're so accustomed to just jumping right to the culmination of their waiting that we rarely think about them actually waiting, and yet they did wait. They waited for approximately 10 days, we believe. Now, when we read about it, it begins in Acts chapter 1, verse 12. In verses 14, 15, it tells us they waited in prayer and they waited together. Now think about those disciples waiting together in prayer and waiting and praying and waiting and praying and waiting and praying. Did they ever start to get antsy? I wonder if any of them thought, maybe we should do something. Hadn't Jesus done a lot? I mean, he did a lot of preaching, for example. Well, there you go. They could follow his example. They could go out on the streets and they could begin preaching. That's a good thing, right? Preaching, talking about the kingdom. What would be wrong with that? Well, there's one thing. Jesus told them to wait. But how long should they wait? After he ascended to heaven, the waiting began. And what did they do? Wait a day? 2 days? I think on day 3, we Americans would be going stir crazy. But they weren't Americans. They were not used to our fast-paced culture. Maybe they had no problem waiting for a little bit longer. 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, I don't know. But I still have to wonder, wouldn't at least some of them start to get really upset about all this waiting? I mean, there were details to be cared for. There were 120 of them, we read in verses 14 and 15. Would all 120 of them do nothing but wait for days on end? I mean, where did they stay? What space could fit that many people? Did they have to rent it? What about the food? That's a lot of food to feed that many people. Who paid for all of this? Certainly some of them had to go to work, right? I mean, they had to make money. Now, these are all speculative questions. But I ask them for a reason. It is difficult to wait. I bring up these questions because of how easily it is for us to get distracted when we're waiting. Life is filled with all those kinds of practical concerns, that during a prolonged period of fixed waiting for the Holy Spirit, it just doesn't seem realistic to just wait and wait and wait. It actually seems irresponsible. The result is that far too often we give in to the temptations to take matters into our own hands, and we just start doing stuff. Now, we don't call it stuff, of course. We call it ministry or mission. The reality is, no matter what it is that we're doing, when we are doing activities of our own choosing, we are not waiting. And Jesus has called us to wait. Now, interestingly, we can learn about the apostles and how they waited during that 10-day time. The authors remind us that Acts chapter 1, verses 12 through 26 tell the story of the waiting. And they tell us Peter started getting twitchy. Now, they're referring to the story in when the apostles decide that they need to replace Judas, the apostle who betrayed Jesus and killed himself. They have a gap. They only have 11 of 12. And so they decide to fill the gap, the 12th apostle. The authors of the book write this: Peter decides it's time for some church administration. When the church feels the heavy burden of the command to wait for God to act, inside the uneasy waiting, it becomes easy to distract ourselves with meetings and procedures and politics and more. We simply have a hard time waiting. So in Acts chapter 1, we read what they did. The apostles cast lots, and the lot fell to a man named Matthias, and he is never again mentioned in the New Testament. In fact, this method of casting lots, which was rooted in the Old Testament, that's never mentioned again in the Old Testament either. And the authors suggest that this action, instead of waiting, this action of casting lots, was not in God's desire for the apostles. Did they take matters into their own hands? Now, we don't know for certain. God doesn't punish them or anything like that. But it is fascinating to consider how God, the authors tell us, will clearly go on to choose another apostle, Paul. And that apostle, Paul, does significant spirit-empowered work for the kingdom. So what do we do with this struggle that we have with waiting? Well, the authors say that we need to tell ourselves a different story. The disciples are the church, not through church administration, but through the stories of Jesus' own life, death, and resurrection. The church is birthed and called to wait because it is always to be looking for the living Jesus Christ's action in the world. For the church, waiting is the way of attentive looking, they write. In other words, we are not the star of the story of the church. I encourage you to read all of pages 72 through 74, where they do a wonderful job explaining this. The story of the church is the story of Jesus. We enter into his story. And we do that by dying to ourselves. Now remember, in the previous chapter, they were telling us about the practice of being and not having. And one of the three ways we practice being and not having is by dying to ourselves in humility. And Jesus is the ultimate example of this, which we read about in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. We die to ourselves by focusing on the true star of the story, and that's Jesus. For example, the authors suggest, why did the Apostle Paul go on to start all those churches in his ministry? They write, Paul starts churches not for the sake of the churches, not to stave off decline or accelerate growth, but for the sake of forming communities that serve the world by witnessing to God's acts in the world. Do you want to know the content of Paul's preaching? It was the resurrection of Jesus, over and over again. And so the authors write, the waiting that God invites us into is not a dull void, but an invitation to participate in God's own life. What a wonderful invitation, that we can participate in what God is doing in His life and His work in the world. But how? How do we wait? What does this waiting actually look like? Should we stop all of our church administration? Should we stop our worship services? Should we stop all our programs and our events? Does waiting mean shutting down the church? Do you feel the anxiety in those questions? I definitely do. If the church shuts down, then that will almost certainly affect my paycheck. It might take it away. Am I suggesting that we should be waiting to the point where we are doing nothing and we must close the church and I have to go get another job? Those are tough questions. But what I want to examine is what's underneath those questions. The authors point out what's under all of that is a desire for the survival of the church. For the church to be the star of the story. Now, we spiritualize it, of course, saying that if the church doesn't survive, then what about all the people in our community who need Jesus? Or what about all of the care for the members of our church? They won't have it anymore. Therefore, if we don't make the congregation the story of its own story, if we don't get moving faster and faster, we're only going to be left with memories and regrets, the authors write. But it's a lie. The authors say, actually, waiting is our friend. The only way we can survive is by waiting. I think, how? It doesn't make sense. They say this, here's how. Waiting puts our attention in the right place. Focused on God and His action. They write, attention ought not be on the church, but on the God who moves, the Jesus who lives, bringing life out of death. So there are some serious ramifications to this. Our busyness, our events, our programs, our viewpoint on church is self-focused far too often. It's preservational. And it has been that way for decades. It's entirely possible that we have not been waiting and looking for God for a long, long time. And so the authors say, from our vantage, the secular age that leads to acceleration is just a crisis. Taking our attention away from the story of God and putting it squarely on the crisis of decline. So for you and I, although this might just feel so counterintuitive, and it will feel counterintuitive for those of us who are not accustomed to waiting, we focus on the story of Jesus by waiting and watching for God's Spirit to act so that we might be ready to join Him. We need to learn how to wait. I think it's highly likely that we American Christians in 2023 have never been part of a waiting church, ever. I think it's highly likely it's entirely foreign to us. We've bought into the lie, the authors write, that fortune favors those who do not wait. Those who have their own story and act in and for that story, which they are the star of. But again, it's a lie. We Christians are part of Jesus' story. So the authors conclude the part Jesus does command the church to play in His story is to wait. Wait so that the Spirit can lead the church in following Christ in the world. I think we need to learn to wait. I think we don't know how to. I think we need to learn to watch for the Spirit. Have you ever been discipled or trained or mentored about how to wait and watch for the Spirit? If you never have, I'm right there with you. This is not something that I have been accustomed to either. And I'm excited to continue studying the book as we learn to wait and watch so that we might follow the Spirit in His work in the world.